So in today's video, I would like to address the story of what became of the celebrated company known as Montana First Lokla. So that is today's subject. What became of this company? Now, this was a company that was originally formulated where the company traces its foundation from 1790, when the original ancestors had begun to work with watches in the trade. And now they have, of course, officially registered in the French almanacs we can find from 1818. And the company continued until approximately 1888, very possibly 1889, but most likely by 1888. They had ceased to function in business. And it's a very interesting story. This is perhaps a very common situation with the somewhat smaller Swiss companies at this period in time. We need to look at the event of the 1876 Philadelphia International Exhibition. Now, this exhibition served as a wake-up call for the Swiss watch industry, because at this point, the American mass production was starting to really kick in, and many of the Swiss attendees of this exhibition left the show in utter shock at the massive scale of watch production and the incredibly low cost at which they were able to produce such high quality pieces. And essentially, the writing was on the wall. And in fact, a very famous article came out after the show by one of the key movers and shakers in this industry, who would later go on, was it in Audemars, an engineer, to discuss this problem. And he wrote an article entitled "Wake Up, Swiss Watchmakers." And so this was the scenario. We can see by the statistics that in 1870, Swiss watch production represented, was it something like 70% of world watch production. And this would begin to crash. And by the 1880s, it was becoming extremely difficult. It was snowballing, essentially, and many watch firms were under intense pressure from this American competition. And in the case of Montana First Lokla, we find that one of the original founders, or the child of one of the original founders, Charles Adolphe Montandon, he had been ailing, and we see actually in his necrology, he died in 1886. It is mentioned that he died from a long and painful illness. So around the time of 1883, 1884, it's already evident that his son, Charles Albert, is forced to take over the business. And there is a mention of a bankruptcy which was filed around 1883, 1884, which they were eventually able to settle amicably with all owed parties. And this was quashed, but the business was somewhat reconstituted under C.A. Montandon Lokla. This would have been Charles Albert Montandon. Yet Montana Furs, as a known commodity, was still functioning, and there were still patents under the name and poinçons, or hallmarks, which were registered. Now, these would all be transferred to an Albert Boss by 1887, and we find mention now, there is in the Fédération, La Fédération Horlogère Suisse, from September the 30th, 1887. Réalisation d'horlogerie. Monsieur C.A. Montandon offre à vendre en bloc par lots ou au détail le grand assortiment de mouvements de montre, remontoir et à clef, à tout degré d'avancement, en tout genre, toute grandeur et toute qualité, provenant de la liquidation de la maison Montandon Frères. Plus de 6000 mouvements, ouvrages signés et bons courants, quelques pièces compliquées, s'adresser à M. Albert Boss, fabricant d'horlogerie, 218 rue de la Côte au Locle, lequel se chargerait de terminer les montres pour les payer. So basically, this article is citing, and this was from La Fédération Horlogère Suisse, the sale of over 6,000 movements and watches, complicated pieces, etc. So this was a huge stock of inventory, and clearly the company was liquidating its assets. Now, it is not mentioned, obviously, in this statement. However, we know actually that the decision to liquidate was made public by Charles Albert Montandon, who would have been continuing the business. Now, the father had died in 1886, but by 1883, apparently, he had already been searching for a way out of the watch business. And he was a member of, now, this is Charles Albert, the National Geographic Society. He was a member of the Masonic Lodge Alpina. So he was a Freemason as well. But in his letters and notations with the Geographic Society, he appears to have been studying and possibly succeeded in clinching a legislative deal with the Argentinian Assembly for immigration benefits, tax-free status and whatnot, with the Argentine public, and he may have been in Buenos Aires for this. However, by 1884, it becomes evident that him and a business partner, this is Charles Albert Montandon, and a business partner, this is with the allied family, the Jacot Descombe. Now, Charles Albert was married to the Sophie Jacot Baron. So it's with this Jacot family. The last part of this name is the allied family. So they had decided on the Dominican Republic, and they had achieved the same benefits, a tax-free agreement with the local government, because they would be producing goods in the country. And the country at that time was ruled by a dictatorship, and this was the dictatorship, a junta of Ulises Heró. Now, they succeeded in acquiring rent-free 5,000 hectares of land, and the two families set up 2 colonies. And one was called Helvetia, and the other was called L'Evolution, Evolution. And the one that was called Evolution was run by Charles Albert Montandon. Now, this is a very interesting story of what occurred, but essentially, these partners have succeeded in establishing an agreement with Suchard, or Russe Suchard, a Swiss chocolate company. It was quite huge, and it was selling chocolate all over Europe. We see various different period advertisements for the chocolates. And this was a huge venture. And so they had become cocoa farmers. And they had their cocoa plantation included this 5,000 hectares. Now this territory had, they invested a huge amount of money. They created villas, and we can see the Swiss Federation flag flying in their encampments. There was a monorail which connected the plantations to a river, and from there to the seaport of this place was called Samana de la Mer, or de la Mar in Spanish. So they also, and this was a huge feat, they also installed a 10-kilometer telephone line so that they would have communications with the outside world, obviously. But the plantation was really fantastic. They had their own workshops. They had a woodworking, carpentry workshop for their needs. They acquired herd animals. And it's really interesting. The Musée d'Art et d'Histoire de Neuchâtel has a lot of digital imagery on their site, which is very, it has a huge, it's a huge digital collection of pictures of these colonies. And we can see how the colonists were operating there, including the men who were walking around the plantation armed. We can see the holsters. They were carrying sidearms. This was, to be remembered, very frontier-like nation, the Dominican Republic. And so obviously this was a local requirement, but it's quite fascinating what they were able to achieve, that within the space of several years, they had 50,000 cocoa plants, and this later extended, they had grew to 100,000 cocoa plants. This was the largest cocoa plantation in the Caribbean, in all of the Antilles. And this was really a bold feat. And it also it should be noted that it suffered from a series of setbacks. When the colonists first started up in business, they were hit very severely by a currency conversion, which gobbled up a lot of their resources. They also were beset by, among these there were other economic challenges. There were natural catastrophes. A cyclone hit the island and destroyed much of the island. And the junta that was actually backing them was removed from power. This dictator was assassinated in 1899. So by the turn of the century, matters had really started to become really dire. In fact, there was also a dispute that arose with the company that they were supplying the cocoa with, this Rus Suchard, and this matter eventually would go to the Supreme Court. But by 1901, 1902, the colonists were even at some point evicted from the premises. So things had gotten really out of hand, and one of the main principals, Charles Albert, died in 1903. So his partner, Henri, or Enrique, as they call him locally, Jaco de Combe, was continuing these legal battles. Now the children of Charles Albert, he had 2 sons and a daughter, and they all remained on the island, and they continued in their local pursuits. So, and we see decades later letters from them to the public and to relatives and friends in Switzerland about life and how things are going. And so this is quite interesting. But this legal battle would continue until at least 1906. Now, the partnership of Charles Albert and the Jaco de Combe would file a claim for $4.5 million this may be local currency, it's not stipulated, but in damages and losses against the Suchard. Eventually, by 1917, it is mentioned that the eviction and the debts were quashed by the Supreme Court. So it is interesting to note that eventually, in posterity's sake, this matter would be resolved in their favor. Now, it is also interesting to put out, and by the way, I should say that that was the Supreme Court of Santiago who quashed this eviction. Now, let us discuss, I would like to go into detail about the style of the flavor of this colony. And I mean, this is really an incredible story. We do find in the Gazette de Lausanne from 1888 a letter from Charles Albert Montandon to Mr. Jules F.U. Jurgensen, and this is Urban Jurgensen, Jules Frederick Urban Jurgensen, and so he is writing this. I will read this in English because it's quite interesting, but Mr. Jules F.U. Jurgensen at Le Locle, and this incidentally is entitled A Swiss in the West Indies. He publishes in the Feuille de Vie des Montagnes a letter addressed to him by a Swiss, Mr. C.A. Montandon, that's Charles Albert, established in Samana in the Dominican Republic. We extract the following. I lead the life here that I've always dreamed of, to be at last in my normal state. All I need is to be able to bring up my family, but I cannot suddenly interrupt the education of my children. We live in peace in a very primitive simplicity, sometimes at the edge of a bay whose beauty is almost incomparable, sometimes in our Savane des Indiens, where we have planted the federal flag in the center of virgin forests and immense prairies in which the government has granted us domain free of charge of 200 hectares. It would later balloon to 5,000. Our cocoa plantation is making progress. We have planted 20,000 plants, transplanted, and soon 40,000 in nurseries. It is a lot of work done to be done, so we have little leisure. I console myself for the privations I endure by noting that the 5-year-old trees bring on average a good year, bad year, between 1 franc to 1.25 francs net, and that this would yield 2 francs a year quite net from the 7th or 8th year. Here's what is known and proven. This is what is known and proven. Remains the unknown at which it is prudent to give up 2/3 of the expected product. In this most unfortunate case, the case would not be bad, given the lifespan of the cocoa trees, which reaches a century. In the meantime, we sell some watches, some jewelry, and we plant some tomatoes, rice, beans, etc. for our needs and for the consumption of the towns and villages of the region, where we were accustomed only to the tropical crops. We have demonstrated that our vegetables are successful, and we hope to derive some profit from them while waiting for the cocoa harvest. A Swiss immigration would be welcome here as a pampered child. To begin with, we will soon start to have to procure 2 or 3 choice cow herds. Perhaps our modest enterprise will open up a new country to Swiss farmers, rich in soil, poor in arms, and one day we will succeed in founding a large colony there. The climate of our region is excellent, above all pleasant. Any sober and robust European can get used to it and work in it, avoiding the sun in the middle hours of the day. We have near our agricultural station a river, 2 rivers, several streams, and torrents. The river and 2 of the rivers form our eastern and western boundaries. To the north of the lands of the state extend to infinity, and there is no room for and there is room for a population equal to that of French Switzerland. So this is large. The Yenikwa River surprised us. A Sodudub or a Stobach, where we go in 2 hours. That is a comparison of local Swiss rivers. A little farther off, in a region inaccessible to the lame people, there is, it is said, a most beautiful Giesbach, once again an allusion to Swiss geography, and 2 amphitheaters in the style of the Creux de Vin, or Creux de Vin, but larger. My companions have brought back all the petrifications and all the Jurassic stones known to the little Lac Loire. The sight of them gave me pleasure, but I especially enjoy in thought the much greater pleasure that Dr. A. Jacquardou will experience when we send him a little later a small collection. And this was dated April 25th, 1888. So it's interesting, many notes here. And obviously the prehistoric fossils that he speaks of that are evidenced and brought to life in their great surprise. Apparently, the colonists brought watches and jewelry with them to sell. So these may be some of the last pieces signed Montagnard Locla that they were still selling, that they were actually selling in the Dominican Republic. And this is an interesting sort of last chapter in the story of Montagnard Locla, that some of these pieces, materialization would have been in this part of North America, and it's even Caribbean area. This is really exciting, and it is of interest, or one wonders if these pieces can still be found today. Yeah, these would have been the last pieces, most likely, of the firm. So, and it's very interesting that they thought of this in advance to as a revenue stream, that they would continue in their old professions in this capacity, at least to generate cash flow or revenue. But this is an exciting chapter. Now, clearly, they were surmounted by many issues. For example, by 1890, the cyclone was a natural disaster. It's not exactly clear to what level this affected them, but they essentially were establishing this colony as early as 1883, but certainly by 1884, and apparently into the early 1900s. And we do not know exactly at what point this tapered off. You know, the relatives, the children, and the other relatives did continue, and they did live in this country, and they did not go back to Switzerland. So Clarence, it was very clear, or evident or clear that they did experience some form of flourishing, but they did appear to totally depart from watchmaking after the transition here. The next generation of Charles Albert, his children, did not continue the business, the watch business. So this is more or less a bittersweet and very adventurous story of these migrants who boldly went forth into this small backwater, which was ruled by a junta, which eventually fell out of favor. And but just the fact that they established this plantation where Charles Albert was in charge of evolution, and the other was Helvetia, that they put in 10-kilometer telephone system to communicate with the civilized world, and built a monorail to transport products. They established the largest cocoa plantation in all of the Caribbean, the Antilles. This is just an amazing chapter, bittersweet, nevertheless, as the economic, it appears to have economically collapsed with these legal battles with their main customer, but it is really a testament to their efforts. And this is the sad end of Montana Press, Lochlaa. But I hope this was a thrilling and interesting tale, and this has been a story time for you and a note for the record. Thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.